It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. So this is our third discussion in the series that we call Public Purpose in the Time of COVID-19. And I am Kattel. I'm professor and deputy director at IIPP, and I'll be chairing tonight's discussion and also looking at your questions and thinking to bring those in during the discussion as well. So our previous talks and also the future talks in this series will be available on our website. So if you haven't heard them, seen them, please go and check them out. Also, I would recommend on our website, you can see our policy briefs and also our other work around COVID-19, various pieces in newspapers and working papers and policy briefs, as I said. So please check them out, and there's a lot more than today's discussion to be found on our website. And also we'll be live tweeting tonight's discussion. So follow us on @IIPP_UCL, and the hashtag for the event today is #IIPP COVID-19, all written together. And as I said, and as Jan said in the beginning, if you have any questions, send them through as we are discussing and speaking. So I will bring them in during the discussions, not only at the end. So we will keep it lively and we will keep it conversational as much as possible. And so today's talk, as you know, is on the topic of market shaping or shaping markets, law, institutions, and governments in the time of COVID-19. So we're in IIPP, what we are really interested in is both radical thinking and policy impact. And so in this series, and especially today, we are looking at the ways governments not only are responding to the crisis, but also how they can actually rebuild the economies following the crisis. So today we are particularly looking at how governments actually can rebuild, reform markets, if you will. And I'm very, very excited about today's speakers. I think through their unique lenses, they're both offer a radical and a unique criticism of capitalism, and not only of the neoliberal variety, but both go in their work back to historical developments and the evolution of capitalism, and offer a radical interpretation of what is going on. So let me first introduce Katharina Pistor. She's Edwin B. Parker Professor of Comparative Law at Columbia University in New York. She writes on corporate governance, money, finance, property rights, and comparative law and legal institutions. And many of you might know her highly acclaimed book, The Code of Capital, and how the law creates wealth and inequality. And this book was named one of the best books of 2019 by the Financial Times and Business Insider. So welcome to Katharina. Our other panelist is Mariana Mazzucato, of course, our director and professor here at IIPP. And as many of you know, her work focuses on the relationships between innovation and direction of growth, with the emphasis on rethinking the public sector role in order to ensure growth that is more innovation-led, inclusive, and sustainable. And I'm sure many of you know her highly acclaimed books from 2013, The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths. That was named one of the best books by Financial Times. And of course, from 2018, The Value of Everything, again, was named one of the best books by Strategy and Business, actually the best book of the year in 2018. And Mariana was also awarded 2018 the Vasily Leontev Award for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. So welcome to Mariana as well. So today's topic, as I said, is about market shaping. So we are really interested in what is common to both Mariana's and Katharina's work, which is very, very much around the idea that the state plays a key role in capitalism, but from a very different angles they come to that. So Katharina argues that as state is acting through the law, it creates what I would call a syntax of wealth. Who, how actually gains wealth and how wealth is generated is very much a business of law, and especially law that is then backed by the state's power. And Mariana, on the other hand, argues that through investing into solving fundamental challenges, the state is creating very much the infrastructure of the future in the widest possible sense in technologies, institutions, and markets. So today we are really focusing on this pivotal aspects of capitalism, the role of the state in shaping, and through law, through investment, through institutions, through regulations, the markets. And I've proposed that we really have a sort of two parts to our discussion. First, I would like to start with obviously our reactions to COVID-19, and then go into and open up the debate into wider questions around the future, the role of the state, and what should we actually focusing on in the near future. So the first question I would like to pose to our panelists today is very much around the idea of evaluating from your own unique perspectives how governments have responded to the COVID-19. So how do you see what we have been experiencing over the last 3 months and also over the next few months from your analytical lenses, Katharina? So how would you evaluate it? What is really has captured your imagination?
Yeah, well, thank you first of all for having me at IIPP today. I'm really delighted to be there. So thanks Rainer and Mariana for inviting me. So my reaction to the government responses to the crisis, let me just say a few words about my general approach to how I think about social systems, economic systems, and markets. So as Rainer has already mentioned, I'm really thinking about markets, economic systems, financial systems as being coded in law. We make commitments to one another, and what law does, we can make commitments as on a personal basis, but what law does, it makes commitments scalable because it adds the coercive powers of a state. Doesn't have to be the state where the people are located, can be a different state, but there's sort of this threat of coercive law enforcement that has allowed us to scale social systems to size. So that's critical, but it also means that law, basically you want to make credible commitment, you want to make binding commitments that connect the past to the future. What a crisis like the COVID crisis does is it disrupts these commitments, right? You can't enforce. If people can't deliver, if they can't leave their houses, if they can't go to work, if they can't accept deliverance, you can't perform on economic terms. So the law has to give at some point. And I think what the crisis has forced us to do is how to think about who has to give and who takes, and what is the role of the government in managing these complex economic systems that we have created with the help of the state, but with the indirect help of the state, right? We're using contract law, we're using property rights, we're using corporate law, we're using collateral law, we're using private law institutions that can be, that basically allow private actors to avail themselves of state power indirectly to fashion their economic relations, both domestically and globally. Once these economic relations come basically to a sudden stop, which is what the COVID crisis has done, the question is, what do governments do? And when they try to go in, do they simply say contracts can't be enforced? Who wins, who loses? Do they offer some support? How much? Who gets what? That's basically, that's the lens through which I'm looking at that. Sort of, can you actually support the system directly, the state? Probably not. The state could be the employer of last resort, the contractor of last resort, but it doesn't have, of course, also all the means to supply what needs to be supplied. So what the state has done in this crisis, it has used the levers it has. And I think you can really see when you look at countries around the globe that governments have employed different levers, and some more successfully than others. The first response was as if we were back in 2008. The first response were central banks just going in there and saying, we will do whatever it takes, right? We just sort of flush the system with liquidity. We make sure that financial markets don't tank at the abyss where we basically were sometimes in March. And they were quite successful in doing so. And then they expanded even that, and they said, well, we'll also support a little bit the real economy, those central banks in the leading states that have the capacity to do so. And then the government stepped in and sort of, took some fiscal measures. And I think what they did, you can describe in general terms, as I had described this earlier in the legal theory of finance papers. They basically relaxed or even suspended the full force of the law by intervening in contracts or providing liquidity where they had not owed liquidity earlier. But they did it, of course, not necessarily equally for all. So you're shifting the bearings of the costs, you're shifting losses in the crisis in a major way. And the government has done this in part intentionally, or has shifted or basically identified winners and has shifted costs to losers. One of the most interesting but also tragic aspects of the crisis, of course, is that you can see that the governments also are sometimes unable to reach the most vulnerable people, even in their own societies, not even to talk about the globe, but even in their own societies. In the US in particular, the government has been unable to reach the most vulnerable through their checks, through other support structures, through the healthcare system. And in that sense, the crisis, I think, has really disclosed or revealed the lack of capacity that states have, in particular when it comes to the most vulnerable parts of the population.
Thank you. I think this idea of the suspension of law creates inequality in itself. I think is very compelling. So Mariana, how would you see through your lenses, or give it the interpretation of what governments have done or not done from your perspective?
So first of all, can I just say, it's so cool to have a seminar series where you can invite people that you're inspired by. So I'm a huge fan of Katharina. So I see this as a wonderful moment of having a conversation. And unfortunately, it's too early in the US to have a glass of wine. Otherwise,
I lift my water to you.
Unfortunately, yeah. And who knows how the reaction would be. So I think what's really interesting is we've come to this problem in similar ways, but actually different, because we're kind of coming from different disciplines, even though we're both, I would say, interdisciplinary. And what I like so much about your work, and the reason I kind of began with that statement, is I feel like you're really one of the most path-breaking people who help us understand the role of law in so many things that otherwise we would almost take as deterministic, that somehow, finance is finance, patents are patents. But a lot of your work talks about financial assets and other types of intangibles like patents as creatures of the law. And so both in terms of our immediate reaction to COVID, as well as what came before, the severity of the crisis, it didn't have to be as severe as it is, as well as how we structure the recovery, hopefully there will be one, but a long run recovery, all these things in some ways are creatures of the law. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that, because I feel that lots of us economists don't understand that. And let me just say something about that, because I said the word interdisciplinary, and we all love to pretend that it's all about bringing different disciplines together. So the economy, political science, the law, sociology, the arts. But actually within each of these disciplines, there's huge silos. So I would actually argue that something that you do, which is bringing the kind of economic and the legal together, is often misunderstood precisely because the economic is so embedded in all sorts of institutions, rules, and legal structures which evolve over time. And so this is in some ways a starting point for IIPP. We always begin by saying the market itself, as limited as it is, we often like to say, maybe that some areas of the economy shouldn't be marketized, of society, but the market itself is an outcome of how we structure the governance, which is often a legal governance within different institutions. So corporate governance inside a company, the governance of what the state does, how it does it, but also in civil society institutions and nonprofits, and then how they relate one to another, how business interacts with government, all these, there's nothing natural about it. How we structure those interactions determines the kind of economy, the kind of market we actually get. And so kind of rendering all these things less deterministic and bringing agency, meaning action, back to the fore, I think is extremely important. And it's also very positive thing to do when we feel like everything's pretty crappy, that we can actually make change. And so I hope that lots of our discussion today will be about what change is needed, and what are the real bottlenecks. And just, in IPP, we're actually working on different COVID task forces in South Africa, in Italy, with the Vatican, where we produce briefings for the Pope every week on his COVID task force. And it's, what's interesting is there's actually heterogeneity in the government response, just to respond to Reiner's question, what government is actually doing. The word government doesn't mean anything. There's different governments around the world, and often they are embedded in different types of capitalism, varieties of capitalism. So countries that are driven by, companies maximizing their shareholder value, focused on quarterly returns, in those countries, the way that business and government are currently interacting around COVID is actually different from some other countries that are driven more by this notion of stakeholder value. And I hope we come back to that later, because I think we need to kind of call out the, I guess we're not allowed to swear on this, but I was going to say bullshit. But anyway, the kind of, the talk, we need to walk the talk about stakeholder value and purpose. And so how do we actually think about the immediate that we need around COVID? So for example, giving cash to certain companies and sectors, entire sectors could go under and become bankrupt, like the airlines. How we do that, how we save the airlines, depends on the version of capitalism that we have. And so one of the things I've been kind of battling out with different policymakers around the world is to say, stop thinking about the state as a handout machine. You're not there just to save a company. You surely have some objectives around sustainable growth, inclusive growth, and how do you actually bring that directionality, right? Because economic growth has not just a rate, but a direction, that directionality to the fore in how we structure the bailouts. So, with the airlines, both France and Austria are having really intense discussions about how to make sure that the bailouts for the airlines include a carbon reduction of the sector. In Denmark, they've been really bold in saying we don't bail out companies that use tax havens. Fantastic. And other countries are just like, here's some money, don't leave, survive. And that's a real missed opportunity, because I think government won't have the upper hand it currently has for a long time. And just lastly, Katharina rightly talked about the financial crisis. Every time there's a crisis, whether it's financial or health related or climate related, there's an injection of cash into the economy. But surely what we can learn from the last big crisis, which was the financial crisis back in 2008, is just putting in liquidity in the system, so cash to save the system, is not enough. Most of that finance that was put in, and it was trillions of dollars worth, of euros worth, was put into the system to save capitalism from basically falling apart. Most of that ended up back into the financial sector, so that's not a good way to put money in the system. So a lot of what IAPP does is to talk about what does it mean to direct finance, not micromanaging, not telling everyone exactly what to do, because then you stifle innovation, but to have a real vision for change, like sustainable growth, inclusive growth, determines how that finance enters the economy and where it goes. And I could go on and on, but I know this is about a conversation between us.
No, that's great. I think I wanted to actually come back to Katharina exactly on this finance, because your work so much also touches on finance and how finance has been actually sort of abusing the legal system, if you will, for shifting or shaping the capitalism to their own will. So how do you view the current sort of bailouts by the governments working in this respect, and have we learned anything from the 2008-9 crisis management?
Well, I think I wish we would learn more. We had learned more, actually. And I wished governments were doing more of what Mariana just was alluding to, is thinking very hard about how to use government levers to also make conditions and make sure that we sort of shape the economy, reshape it in a way that is more conducive to the social norms and the values that people aspire to. So just fixing the system, which is again the agenda, like let's just sort of recover, let's get out of this, and then we just continue as usual. But we're doing this repeatedly, and as we do this repeatedly, we are also seeing that the cleavages in society are actually deepening in countries like the United States, or in countries like the UK and in other countries as well. And to overcome that, I think we have to be more imaginative. Now, on finance in particular, right, we need, of course, the financial system to, as the nervous system or the blood circular system, whatever you want to call it, to keep the system alive. Finance is important. But we also have to realize how misguided in many ways our financial system is as it currently is. Mariana said the crisis didn't have to be as deep as it is. I think that's true. when you think about how much many economies have relied on leverage, right, on debt finance, and in the expectation that in the future everything will be fine or even better and we can pay back our debt, especially pushing this leverage to households and small firms that cannot afford it, right? And so this is, I think, one of the, major construction sites that I see in the future is how to get off our immense dependence on debt finance. And we have to do this not only to deal with a crisis like COVID, where at the end of this, we will not just restart as if nothing happened. We're not just losing a couple of months. We're losing a couple of months where people are accumulating debt balances, their assets are declining, their cash flow will be much lower than it was before. And so how to deal with the debt they have built up earlier, it's just a major problem, right? And you can say, well, you're on your own, you just have to struggle, these are the rules of the game, while at the same time we're handing over the cash to the big companies and out to the financial system to make sure that it doesn't strand. But I think we do have to think quite radically how to restructure the financial system so that we are relying much less on leverage and much more on resources that are available. Let me just add to that, we need this not only for COVID, we need this because of the climate change crisis that we're in already and that is becoming more severe, and therefore relying on, hope for a better future, which is basically what debt finance is all about, does not make that much sense.
Yeah, let me just come to one of the issues that you both are touching upon, which is very much around public-private partnerships, if you will. So I see that our lively audience is asking questions exactly around those issues, basically arguing that how can we change the current partnerships, if you will, that if those partnerships are so much driven by sort of simple notions of efficiency, for instance, that lead to very often actually outsourcing, even regulatory exercises are very much, especially in the finance, or outsourced. So do you see anything happening in a public policy arena that is actually going the other way? Do we have good examples where we have a public-private partnerships emerging now in the COVID that are actually working, either in finance or innovation? Somebody mentioned SpaceX and NASA. So I don't know whether you want to comment on that or not.
Yeah. I mean, if I may, I'm always a bit skeptical about public-private partnerships, not because I don't think this is a good thing, but when you think about how they're structured, I'm very skeptical of the kind of PPPs where the public bears the risk and the private sector skims off the cream, right? And I think one should ask questions about NASA, whether you should outsource part of the functionality of space exploration to a private company, which is ultimately subsidized indirectly by all the resources and all the research that went into making space programs possible, which would have never been possible without the state. And so now you get basically handed over to the private sector. It's, the private sector always comes in exposed, right? The same is for basic research for pharmaceuticals and drugs. You're basically funding the basic research through governments around the globe. And once it's feasible to have a drug, you bring the private sector in and then they skim off the cream. So we have to think about how to structure this. Are there good spaces where we could think about government and private interaction for, in finance? I'm a little skeptical right now. So what I would point to, I mean, clearly there is sort of a very close interaction between private institutions in finance and central banks, and the central banks have been able to bail them out again. Is this a partnership? You could also call it, it's a kind of a symbiotic relationship. It might be parasitic to some extent. I think there's a potential for a better relationship. So I think if the central banks went in and, for example, built something like CBDC, central bank digital currencies, where all households would have access directly to the central bank as an infrastructure that could be used in the future to also deal with households everywhere, just with smartphones without necessarily a bank account, to make sure that they have access to central bank funding. Something like that could be built. It doesn't exist yet. I'm not sure it's going to be built right now. I mean, right now the US is just relying on checks in mails to folks who have paid their taxes to reach their people, right? There's not only postal banking, much less digital banking for everybody else. So I think there's a lot of thinking around this. There is the technology to do this. But the political will to harness these resources to that end, certainly in the United States at least, has not been mobilized yet.
Mariana, I know you have written a lot about public-private partnerships, starting from NASA and all of those other places as well. So, and health, of course, as well. So how do you see currently this actually shaping? Are we seeing anything new, or are we just falling back into our own routines?
So I would take a different lens. The point is not whether we like partnerships or not. It's, again, the structure. And so in the entrepreneurial state, I precisely talked about the fact that we shouldn't just use the word ecosystem or partnership, but define what kind of partnership do we have. And I would agree that the kind of partnership today between NASA and SpaceX is a problematic one. I would also argue that the one we have in the healthcare sector is a very problematic one, as anyone living in the UK knows. The private financing initiatives, the famous PFIs, did not help us strengthen the health system. So how you bring in the private sector into an area that has historically, at least, been driven by public investment, and we could be talking about the railways, health, energy, depends again on what kind of capitalism you want. And when you have a problematic one where the state itself has been decimated for decades in terms of not just, you know, people use the word neoliberal agenda, but literally the lack of investment inside the state. So the loss of state capacity and the increasing use, for example, of consulting companies like the UK using Deloitte, one of the big 4 consulting companies, to do the testing. And surprise, surprise, they lost the tests, like G4S screwed up the Olympic security. So the military had to come in last minute. It becomes a vicious cycle. The more you stop doing, you also don't learn by doing. You can't ride a bike without falling off the bike. And when the state itself stops kind of governing, it also becomes, I don't want to say stupid, but actually in some ways addicted to certain types of private sector actors, regardless of if they're any good, if they're efficient, as they say they are, but they become addicted to it also because almost of the fear that they don't know what to do. And so I think, you know, coming to your question, because I do believe in remaining positive, I could go on with the critique. I've written books about the critique, but the positive side is there are some really exciting initiatives to try to dismantle this problematic, parasitic, you know, predator-prey kind of relationship. And I was just on the phone or on a Zoom call, as we all are, it seems like all day, on Zoom calls last week with the World Health Organization, the director himself, around this issue of structuring a patent pool, so a common knowledge base to provide collective intelligence for vaccine production. Because in the health sector, this is a sector which, again, has not thrived on collective intelligence. It's thrived on lots of public investment. So just in the US, $40 billion a year from the state goes into health innovation, but then the state lacks the kind of governance or doesn't govern the process properly. So the patents get abused. So the problem is not the patents are too upstream, which means that we're actually patenting the knowledge, the upstream knowledge, the research. The patents are too wide, just used for strategic reasons to keep out competitors. The patents are too strong, so hard to license. That's a misgovernance of what could actually be, if well structured, a stimulant for innovation. On top of that, the prices of the drugs often don't reflect that public contribution. So it's a complete scam. So this idea that we absolutely need right away, there's a race for this vaccine. Without a vaccine, without also strong global health systems, we won't get over the crisis. But how do you actually structure the production of the vaccine so it's a really symbiotic situation? And one of the ways that WHO, the World Health Organization, has thought about this is structuring this common patent pool, which means that the knowledge base is really shared. There's more solidarity, not competition between countries. You know, the whole kind of knowledge economy talk is actually then applied to vaccines so that there's lots of learning and that there's mandatory licensing of the patents when it is patented. So there's as much collaboration and knowledge sharing, and that once it's actually discovered, it be made accessible globally, easily manufactured, and ideally free with strong global health systems that can cover the cost. And so this would be an example of paying attention, not just to the production of something like a vaccine, but actually governing the production to meet a public good, public interest criteria.
Thanks. So we are getting really interesting questions from the audience. So let me bring in one from Wolfgang Trechter, actually. So he asks, I think this goes to Katharina, have some legal systems or legal institutions stood up better to COVID-19 than others. So because we can look at from economic systems perspective or public administration systems perspective, and clearly see that some systems are better equipped with COVID to deal with COVID-19 than others. So is there a similarity in the legal systems as well?
Well, I think, yes, there are. And I think much depends on the rigidity of contracts and private relations that are coded in law on the one hand, and the question whether you have some kind of safety valves built into these contractual structures so that you can renegotiate or adapt your contracts or your private relations to a crisis. So, so in some systems, especially sort of in large-scale financial systems, the way we have created a global financial system, I think we have relied very much on the binding nature of law and the training that we have in the structured financial relations that we call shadow banking, where at each level, every investor is just trying to get fixed returns, exactly what they negotiated for, so that they can meet their own budget obligations. That system is not very resilient in times of crisis, right? If you enforce all of these commitments in times of crisis, you will self-destroy the financial system. It can be bailed out only by the central banks coming back. If you have financial structures, and I think to some extent, I think the reforms that were implemented after 2008 for the banks, not for the entire financial sectors, for the banks, that they make them much more resilient in this crisis. They have better capital requirements, so they have more equity, they have more liquidity buffers. So the big banks were relatively better situated than many of the structured financial systems. And of course, in the shadow banking systems, that there's at least 50% of our financial system these days, that's where the stress built up much, much, much faster. Same, I think, in the corporate sector, right? So where in situations where you have practices of renegotiating, of cooperating, and let's go to the stakeholder capitalist version of co-determination or other things, where the world changes. What do you do? Can you sit down around a table? Do you have relations built that can do something other than just enforce your rights right now, but sort of say, can we, how do we deal with the situation? How, who bears some of the costs? How can we get help from the outside? How can we manage through the crisis? I think any system that allows for explicitly and has built practices of adapting to change rather than only enforcing relatively fixed and rigid rights is better situated to deal with this crisis than another.
Thanks so much. So we're getting a lot of questions coming in. I think there seems to be really big interest in public-private partnerships, but I think we have covered that, and we might need to do a separate a talk on those issues, because I think a lot of people are interested in that, and a lot of people are seeing them as part of the bigger problem or a challenge that the governments are facing. I think there's one specifically for you, Mariana, as well, that you might find interesting in this context. This is about sort of the decoupling between GDP and emissions. So should we still see the growth as sort of the economic purpose at all, or is there something that we should actually have a much wider narrative or sort of redefining what should be the the purpose of economic activity?
So, as you know, I'm not a big fan of the degrowth agenda or putting the blame on growth, precisely because of what I was talking about in the beginning, which is how we structure growth, how we structure the organizations and civil society and the public sector and the private sector, determine the kind of growth we get, how we structure their relationships. So the real question is, what kind of growth do we want? And of course, if we want sustainable growth, then that's going to be a very different type of production, distribution, consumption. Carlota Perez, one of our honorary professors in IIPP, is fantastic on this point. I recommend everyone to read her work. So again, admitting the directionality then has, just for the state side, because we're talking, I guess, mainly about that right now in terms of policy, I believe that actually the state doesn't have, and this is sort of an aggregate point, and of course then we look at different countries, the Vietnam experience has been totally different from some other experiences around COVID, depending on the state structures in place, but the state doesn't necessarily, in terms of how it's informed by economics, and economic theory does have a huge influence, unfortunately, on policy. We don't necessarily have the tools that allow us to really understand this immense choice that we have of how to structure our tools and the instruments. And so bringing really the stronger kind of market shaping, market co-creation agenda, not just a market fixing one where the state comes in to solve problems, and so actually having to wait for a problem, right, and to fix it, but to really have a strong agenda like a Green Deal agenda that would require completely changing how we think about tools from grants, loans, procurement strategy that governments have in terms of how they purchase. Governments purchase a lot. They don't just invest, they buy, whether it's desks in schools or equipment to make a bridge or beds to make a hospital. How we structure procurement can actually crowd in all sorts of innovative solutions to meet certain types of goals. So if you decide that you want 100 carbon neutral cities across Europe, that's going to affect how governments procure. And I think we need a much more active discussion about that. And, you know, looking again at this public-private issue that we kind of didn't really resolve completely, you know, that will be determined by what vision you have of growth. So in Germany, they had the Energiewende mission and vision in the country to reduce carbon emissions, and that determined how the state bailed out the steel industry. So the steel industry, like in many different countries, has been having problems over recent years and has been asking for state support. In Germany, that support was conditional on the sector reducing its material content, hence its carbon footprint, and it did that. Or another example I often give to my Italian friends is when Fiat, the car company, went to America to buy Chrysler after the crisis. Chrysler was in government hands because it wasn't just the banks that were bailed out, the whole auto industry was bailed out. Obama, in a rare moment of confidence, told Sergio Marchionne, who unfortunately passed away, he was the manager of Fiat, that purchase of Chrysler was conditional on Fiat promising to make hybrid, right, so carbon reducing engines in the US. And Marchionne said, fine, because it was part of the deal. Whereas in Italy, Fiat hasn't done that. No deal was even asked. Fiat just receives a lot of government subsidies. In Italian, we say piove sussidi, una pioggia di sussidi. It rains guarantees and subsidies, which is exactly what nurtures then this parasitic, problematic, inertial, meaning static, public-private partnership. So I think we need to, get ambitious on both sides. And unfortunately, the value narrative, the kind of storytelling we have of where wealth comes from, where value comes from, pretending it's only in business and at best government can fix a market or enable or de-risk, facilitate, all these really boring, lame words, business, that actually reduces the confidence. I mean, this is almost like a psychotherapy, a therapy point. It reduces the confidence within the policymakers when they then negotiate. And I've seen this in the US, which is a country that actually has had what I call an entrepreneurial state, a state that has acted as an investor first resort in the internet, invested by government, GPS, touchscreen display, most pharmaceutical drugs, most green energy. And yet the confidence often is not there to actually make sure that the deal in how public and private work together achieves a public interest kind of goal. And I think that's where we should be focusing on right now. It's not about public or private or whether to do partnerships. Everything has to happen in partnerships. All the sustainable development goals will only happen in partnership, but how we structure that partnership matters.
Exactly. And this is, I think, where our next question comes from. So it's another old friend of all three of us, I think, Leonardo Burlamacchi. Hi, Leonardo. He asks, unfortunately, we can't see you, Leonardo, but I hope you're doing well. So he asks, one of the hardest questions economists and I guess lawyers do not ask is what sort of political coalitions are necessary for the desired political packages? So how do we get the real sort of the coalitions together that are needed for changing what both of you are talking about, either in the finance or the legal side or on the economic and government side in general? So how do you see sort of those coalitions? How can we get there? What needs to be done?
I mean, this is of course very country specific, but one thing that we have seen, I think, also in the COVID crisis, and this might be a positive aspect of the COVID crisis, a lot of people have reached out to one another. There's been a lot of humanity, right? There has been continuous nastiness from the top in this country, but there has been a lot of humanity and cooperation at the local level and throughout the Trump administration. Quite frankly, we've seen a lot of state governors and cities coming together and resolving complex issues that seem to be unresolvable at the Washington, D.C. Level. So I think fostering that, wherever cooperation is possible, fostering that. And clearly we all know that we need some leadership and you need to have some push from others. I'm just thinking about Europe right now, right? The fact that Germany came out and said that they would support borrowing by the EU on a much larger scale to give grants, not only loans to member states because of COVID, that was a confluence of different factors. I think the German Constitutional Court decision had something to do with that, but also did Macron's pushing. This is the moment for Europe. We have to stand up to that. And now you come out with this, and it's not the big. It's more than a bazooka, but it's not an atomic bomb or something like that to rescue the euro. Is a bad metaphor, but it's not sort of on that scale. But it's much more than we have ever seen before. So you're hoping that in these moments of crisis, there are some leaders who come forward, and sometimes a coalition of leaders. I'm not going to say we need to have the Republicans in this country, will they come and cooperate under a different president? I doubt it right now, frankly. That's not where I would put my money in this country. But I would put my money in a number of state governments and a number of mayors in major cities and hope for them to collaborate, as some have. Also, when the US pulled out of the Paris Treaty, right? Some mayors reached out and says, we will collaborate with other cities in the world and we will reduce our emissions. So you just have to, I think, really adapt to where you are and find the collaborators that you need to resolve these problems.
Great. Mariana, what's your view?
On that question?
Oh, that question.
Okay. You both have questions. I was looking at all the other questions, wondering which one you'd pick next. Well, first of all, just on that last point, it's absolutely right that we see, in some ways, fortunately, but also unfortunately, a bit of a random idiosyncratic response. On the one hand, I find it very, inspiring that you see lots of local initiatives. In Camden, which is the council in London where I live, there's a wonderful leader of the council, Georgia Gould, and we're actually working together, hopefully setting up a new renewal commission for Camden. And it's really, really bold, much bolder in some ways than the national government is providing in terms of a vision for the long run recovery and really kind of having a people-centered approach and thinking about the budget itself as outcomes-based, right? You don't worry about the problem, you don't worry about how much money do I have, and then look at what you can spend it on. The question is, what is the problem? And then you formulate a budget around it. And so this outcomes-based budgeting is something that Camden has been thinking about for a long time and now is implementing around COVID. And similarly, as Katharina said, we've seen around climate, definitely in the US, where state governors like in California, but also city mayors have provided the kind of leadership that unfortunately the federal government simply has not had, also because of the skepticism towards the science, which, a 16-year-old Greta has to tell the US president, the science matters, please can you go read it. However, unfortunately, that doesn't work as a system. You absolutely need that kind of systemic effect where you have kind of all cities and all states also being led by some sort of vision. Otherwise, you have too much uncertainty. So in terms of the private investment side of things, and I know it's not all about private investment, but we should remember that we are currently living in an era of capitalism where we have huge financialization within the business sector. So lack of reinvestment of profits, lots of money and profits and net income being used just to buy back shares, to boost stock prices, stock options, executive pay. How to actually both set up new rules of the game, legal structures that in some ways force that reinvestment or make some of the extent to which we have share buybacks illegal as it used to be, but also how you structure kind of a vision of change which crowds in that private finance. So unless there's certainty about what the policies will be around climate, there's kind of a worry and a huge risk averseness from the private sector side. So part of government's role is, first of all, as I would argue, to be an investor first resort in the difficult areas where the private sector is not willing to go, but also set up all sorts of policies that create an environment where business can actually expect or have expectations about what the environment in a sector will look like for 5 years at least, if not 10 or 15. And if you don't have that, that risk averseness that we know exists in the private sector is even greater. And so, you know, as long, you know, it's nice that you have these city level kind of policies, but unless we get that steer, a direction set, which can then again crowd in all sorts of bottom-up innovations and investments, then it's very hard to have a transition and a transformation. And on top of that, the laws actually in some cases also have to change. As I mentioned, financialization could easily be taken care of if it became, you know, partly illegal, but also if government would stop allowing those companies that do engage in those kinds of practices, as well as the tax havens I mentioned before, wouldn't have access to, for example, the public investments in energy, health, and space.
Yeah. I mean, if I can just add to this, I think what I would add is you probably have to take away sort of the ease with which you can create financial assets and make money of that to do any kind of investment. So I don't think it's just the lack of certainty that prevents people from investing. It's the ease with which you can make money in the current financial systems by just collateralizing anything and just turning it over again and again. That's just, you can't compete with that with as much legal certainty as you want on the other hand. So that punch ball has to be taken away.
I agree. And also, I mean, if you look at the tax policies that have rewarded short-termism over long-termism, they also came about through kind of narratives and storytelling about where wealth comes from in the economy. So I do often go back to that, which is, you know, capital gains tax is crazy how low it is, but also the structure of capital gains where you can have the reduction in the tax even if you've just invested, say, 1 or 2 years. That's, you know, that could be changed overnight and actually reward kind of the long-termism that we need for fighting almost any of the challenges that we're talking about. But I completely agree with you. I used to battle it out with Nick Stern when he would only focus on the uncertainty question, say, no, but you also need a much more active and proactive role of policy beyond just the...
Let me follow up on the last debate you had, or last exchange, which is basically around the ease of creating money or ease of creating assets. Can we actually direct this in certain directions, like the green but also other issues? What is sort of stopping us of directing that actually in a directions that we want as a society?
Well, I think you could, of course, change this because we know exactly how it was made, right? You can just trace back how sort of financial assets can be turned, or it's, you know, basically it's, you know, it's an IOU. You promise me something in the future. How can I make that sort of legally more viable? So you create the kind of certainty that many people want to buy it. And so you use collateral law, you use trust, you just take different asset pools that are legally separated from one another. And then you basically, you know, still give the full effect of law enforcement and enforceability to whatever kind of assets the private sector creates. And if push comes to shove, and of course the private sector will overinvest in these assets and create inherent instability. If then the financial system is crashing, the central bank steps in and is the dealer of last resorts and buys all the assets that nobody else wants to buy anymore. That's what we've done now repeatedly. And so if you stop that, I think that will go away. It will go away at a huge cost now because we have a huge system. You know, I think the FSB has estimated that about 50% or more of our financial system now relies on what we call shadow banking system, which is basically relies on these private contracting strategies. And so you can't kill a system like that without paying a huge price. So you have to think about how to shift it, how to gradually get out of this, or impose similar regulatory restrictions on them as you have imposed on banks, just to create a kind of a level playing field with institutions that have become a bit more stable. So the one thing, you know, this is something I think is really important when you think about law and legal institutions as fundamental for markets or social systems. We create it as humans and as societies, but it doesn't mean that we can as easily take it back or change it completely. Because the whole point of law is that we connect the past to the future, that we make these binding and credible commitments. So you can't just, you know, just completely redesign it from one day to the next. We have agency, we do have agency, but we also have built a system that sort of somehow ties us to the structures that we have already created that can't be easily changed from one day to the next. It has to be done very strategically.
Mariana, you have written a lot about direction of finance and directionality of finance. So how do you see the key sort of issues there at the moment?
So I would agree with everything that Katharina said, but on top of that, unless you have certain institutions in place, it doesn't happen. So in Europe, for example, the presence of the European Investment Bank, so that we don't just have the European Central Bank, but also another bank, which is now actually be called the Climate Bank, which provides patient, long-term, committed strategic finance from the public sector in areas that are critical for transformation, whether it be a health transformation that we absolutely need right now, stronger health systems, but especially the Green Deal, which in Europe, at least a month before COVID struck, was still very much on the agenda. Hopefully it still is. In fact, Ursula von der Leyen says it is, which I'm very encouraged by. But without certain types of institutions like public banks or promotional banks, state banks, then often the money that does come in doesn't actually find its way into the real economy. And that was the point before that I mentioned. In the financial crisis, trillions were put in. It ended up just back into the financial sector. In the UK, where I'm sitting now, something like 80% of finance just finances another part of the financial sector. So finance, insurance, and real estate. The acronym is usefully FIRE. So our planet is on fire, not just because of global warming, but because of the structure of finance. And that's not only due to the issues that Katharina was talking about before, but it's also due to the lack sometimes of institutions that help direct that. In the US, by the way, they don't have a public bank, but they do have very active strategic public agencies like, DARPA in the Defense Department, which was critical to the investment in the internet and more recently in all sorts of different digital technologies, but also the National Institutes of Health, which I mentioned before. And in some ways they have played a bit this role, because by investing in the really difficult areas where then business follows, that helps to direct finance. But most of my research earlier in the day, when I wasn't yet obsessing about the public sector, I looked a lot at VC funding of small companies and the kind of innovation finance. And it's not really true that there's a lack of supply of finance for SMEs, for example. There's plenty. There's just not enough good SMEs to finance. I know this is a bit of a controversial point. And the reason that is we don't have strong innovation systems and decentralized network of different public actors, which are critical, like those that create linkages between science and industry. And without those, then you don't actually have an ability of startups, for example, to scale up. And so we shouldn't really worry about startups, but that scaling up has historically been fundamentally correlated to kind of active strategic public entities. And so without those, you can have all the perfect kind of laws, et cetera, but you're not going to get new opportunities in the system. And so when you flood the system with finance, it doesn't have much, anywhere to go.
Yeah. So Mariana, you mentioned actually European Investment Bank, and we have Shiva Tustar from European Investment Bank online asking a question. So we should, of course. Hi, Shiva. Yeah. It's turning out into
on your friends, Rainer. You have to.
Sorry. Yes. No, but yeah.
I'm kidding.
You just have good friends. No, anyway. Yeah, so she is actually asking, what should an European Investment Bank like institutions actually do now? What advice would you, both of you, give to them? Where should they, what kind of intermediaries should they use? What kind of, legal constructs should they be actually striving towards as well?
This is for me.
Both of you, yes.
I think, what kind of legal constructs, I think the law in that sense should be subservient to a broader strategic goal that you want to build. So I think, when we're thinking about health, we're thinking about financial resilience, we're thinking about innovation in the green economy, and hopefully maybe beyond sort of the greenwashing strategies of labeling and indicator building, but really green strategies. So I think, let's just pick health and green for the European Investment Bank. That would be a huge area. What kind of legal structures? I think you can retool the legal structures that we have in many ways. You may want to have more of what Mariana was talking about, some intermediaries that can help channel the funding in the right direction, or that can sort of screen companies that have the capacity really to invest in these kind of new innovative strategies, because without that, you might just sort of spending the money there, or you might sort of create new legal institutions that will not be taken up. But I think the law in principle is there. I don't think there are many bottlenecks, you can think about some regulatory structures maybe in the health systems that have to be eased out. But I think you can retool the legal systems to achieve these goals. You need to have these goals, and you have to have some channels through which to get the resources that one has to reach these goals. And not to, I mean, like, this is something I'm really nervous about in this entire sort of Green Deal, green investment. There's so much brain power invested right now in sort of these indicators for what is green, what is not, and they're issuing, the airports issuing green bonds. I mean, that's just hard to believe unless you really get some, reduction, I think, in overall air travel, or new kinds of ways in which we can get the airplanes into the air without carbon emissions. So I think there's just a lot of faking going on there, a lot of greenwashing going on there, and I think major law firms and other intermediaries are involved in that. And so redirecting this to more fundamental, basic investment in green energies is much more important, or green production.
Yeah, I mean, so we've worked very actively in IAPP in helping Europe kind of change how it thinks about its tools. So this notion that instead of just dispersing funds kind of, I don't want to say randomly, but around kind of voodoo topics like small companies or particular sectors, or even just really, really broad strategies, which then it's hard to monitor what you're actually doing, to really kind of learn from the moonshot. And, coming back to this issue of space before. So what was interesting with the moon landing is that it was very specific, right? The goal was to get a man, unfortunately it was a man at the time, to the moon and back again in one generation. The challenge was much wider. It was the space race, that kind of Sputnik moment. And today the challenges, I think, are the SDGs, and lots of them are either health related or climate related. So if we took them seriously, if you begin with the SDGs and turn them into missions as concrete as, a plastic-free ocean, or 100 carbon neutral cities in an area, or today in light of COVID, really kind of inspirational missions, not only around the health issue, but also the digital divide. I've got 4 children, they're all at home, so I can't wait for them to get out of the house. But in the meantime, they're being educated pretty well because we have strong broadband. We have, a pretty high cultured family. That's kind of luck. And lots of their friends and also lots of people around the world are not being educated very well right now due to, again, the strength of the broadband, the amount of credit on your phone, the technology that you have in your house. And so really ambitious missions that are about reducing the digital divide, all those require finance. And it's really interesting to think of the role of the European Investment Bank, but also other types of public finance to really fuel that patient long-term finance for lots of innovative solutions, but not, again, because you just want startups, but because you want to solve a problem. As ambitious as getting a man to the moon and back again in one generation, but around our social and wicked problems. And again, strengthening the welfare state, which we've realized with COVID is a huge problem. Our health systems have not been resilient. That's what I meant in the beginning when I said that the crisis has been worse than it had to be. In the UK, we have been cutting the finance to the National Health Service, so we can clap as much as we want on Thursdays or throw money last minute to the health service. But if it has, in the meantime, if its structure has been weakened, we have a problem. But instead of just going back to the romantic thing of, oh, we just need exactly what the NHS was from the beginning, we should be really engaging against civil society and different actors on what is the modern kind of welfare state we need, and even within that have really bold missions around what we want from our public services, and what, how to deliver really important areas, including the future of mobility, and have missions underneath them. And I think the EIB has adapted to that, and I know Shiva knows that because we've worked closely on that. It's focused a lot on this issue of the circular economy, but I think it'll be really curious what happens now in the EIB in terms of the well-being economy, the healthy economy, as well as helping other countries, even outside of Europe, strengthen their health system. Because one thing we've learned with COVID is we're only as healthy as our neighbor is, literally on our street, in our city, in our country, and globally. Had this crisis begun in Africa, where the health systems are so much weaker than in China, you can bet we would all be actually even more worse off than we are today. So strengthening global health systems, I think, should be one of the priorities of the EIB.
Excellent. So I think there's 2 or 3 emerging areas here that I see from the chat and from your discussion as well. So one is around global. sort of multilateral institutions and their role. I think there's a question about Google and Apple and their power, and should we try to, can we regulate them? Should we do that at the moment? Is that somewhat relevant? And of course also, as you, Mariana, were talking about, global health issues like access to vaccines and all these kind of issues. So what kind of role do you see for global institutions and multilateral institutions at the moment, and especially, I think, going forward?
I mean, let me just say one thing again to explain where I'm coming from in my thinking. I think what we have to realize is that we have multiple layers of globalization and also multiple layers of legal globalization. So we have a couple of multilateral institutions or global institutions. We have the WHO, the World Health Organization, the WTO, whatever is left of it right now, the World Trade Organization. We of course have the World Bank and the IMF, etc. So these are these global institutions that were created by international treaty by sovereign states. For finance and most of trade, beyond basically the agreements we make through the WTO to keep our borders open, etc., most of the contractual and legal relations are actually based on private law institutions that are domestic institutions. So private actors have knitted together a global system of law that allows them to trade globally without a global treaty between countries. What they need are open borders. So for that you need treaties and some basic protection perhaps. But the rest they've done on their own through contract law and then through a body of law that we call conflict of law rules, which basically are domestic rules that determine which country's legal system will be applied to a given set of facts. And over the last 30 or 40 years, most countries have given private parties a lot of autonomy, private autonomy, to pick and choose the rules they like, where they set up a corporation, which countries' laws shall govern their contracts, and when they want to issue financial assets that are treated as property right in a certain way, whether they can use basically the location of the issuer to pick the country and the legal system under which they want to issue their laws. So I've made the point earlier that for financial assets, most of the privately issued financial assets in the globe are governed by English law or the law of the state of New York. Right? So we have hegemony there, we have not globalization there. So we have a hierarchically structured global system that is hierarchically structured because the most powerful private actors have chosen these laws. So that exists on one hand, and on the other we have sort of the attempt then by states to start to collaborate around some international treaty laws. Some of the treaty laws we know, the bilateral investment treaties, the multilateral or regional investment treaties have been used also to strengthen the hands of private actors vis-a-vis states. Some of that just requires some rebalancing. I don't think we're in a moment where we would recreate, I don't know, a global trade organization or financial institution. We have the FSB, it's done quite well, although I think there's also a lot of hegemony creep back into that organization as well. But I think what we have to understand better is how much states have effectively outsourced the picking and choosing of law to private parties that make it actually very difficult, even for domestic states to gain control over especially financial intermediaries, but also over some corporations where they shift their taxes or engage in regulatory arbitrage of all kinds of things. So I think we have to look at those two together, and one is not necessarily the solution for the other, but one has to think about also how to rethink these conflict of law rules, and when you might simply say, well, we will not recognize you as a corporation just because you're in the Cayman Islands and you have no employees and you have the same board of directors that every other company in the Cayman Island has. Why should we recognize this legal shield, right? Or I've made the point in Davos in January, and I said, if we really want to be serious about climate change and thinking about investors, making sure that they know where they invest and where they should not invest, well, maybe we should basically deny limited liability for the shareholders, the investors in companies that are investing something that we know is hurting certain outcomes. So that's the kind of conversation I'd like to bring in, not only sort of a new sort of policy regime. I'm not saying we shouldn't have that. We need that cooperation, but we should realize that a lot of action is happening in the shadows of the private law institutions, and that gives a lot of power to key players who know how to use it.
Yes, I think, Mariana, you want to comment on this one as well?
I mean, I was going to say a comment on the digital side of things, but if you want to,
no, it's fine. Yeah, you can go on the digital side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just state the obvious, but I think it's a really important point, which is that unfortunately in moments of crisis, we tend to take our eyes off of things which just the week before we thought were really, was really important. So the kind of power and the monopoly power of big tech was a huge issue. It was being discussed. And now that power has, doubled, if not more. We are all, the technology we're using now, but also how we buy things in Amazon because we can't go to the grocery stores, the movies we're watching at night through Netflix, it's increased, and the degree to which that needs to be governed, both in terms of the privacy issues which came to the fore, but also the taxation issues in terms of having wealth taxes, not because we want to punish the companies, but precisely because the underlying technology and the social infrastructure which these companies have benefited from, and which have also created in many cases a first mover advantage, needs to be governed in the sense of making sure that the revenue also comes back to a public purse, which can make those same investments in the future of the internet again, instead of actually crippling the public purse. And so that question of the wealth tax and governing the digital commons is huge, but also this issue of the lack of capacity or the weakened capacity in state structures, we're witnessing it. Even how the app, these apps that are coming out to do the test and tracing, in some countries, including in Europe as a region, there's a real discussion of how to make sure we structure that app in such a way that it abides by all sorts of different governance issues around privacy and participation, and others just in the kind of race for the app or the race for the vaccine are embedding very problematic structures. And so I think it's especially in these moments that, yes, of course we need immediate solutions, but how we govern and structure those solutions really matter in terms of fostering the kind of society that we actually want. And I mean, this is why in IIPP, we've partnered actually with certain organizations and people like Mike Bracken, who set up GDS, Government Digital Services, because of that attention to the details. So one of the things they did in setting up a public sector website, which later became gov.uk, was from the beginning say, we're doing this with the idea that the citizen is not a client or a customer, these words that have filtered in how we think about schools, right? Students are clients or customers of schools, patients in hospitals are customers or clients of hospitals, but they're real kind of users, and focus on the user experience with the welfare state, how you get your passport, how you get your motor vehicle license, how you vote. That how structures your kind of everyday living, and making sure that it's not structured as a clientele kind of private sector relationship, but a true kind of public interest, public value experience is important. And organizations like the BBC have thought about this for decades through their public value debates.
If I can just say
yes,
just
please,
a word about the digital economy as well. This is also really interesting. I'm involved in a project where we think about, what data is and how data are governed. And most of the courts, for example, in common law jurisdictions such as the United States, are treating data as any good old thing or stuff. And so it's falling through the cracks, right? So you can't sue a big tech company because they've taken your data and made tons of money on that, or they have infringed your rights for tort, because you don't have any economic value in your own data, because at the non-aggregate level, they have no value, right? Or in competition law, is this a product? Because we define markets by products. Is a data point a product? If it's not, how do we define these markets all of a sudden? So wherever you go, this is where, what I said before, law sort of ties the past to the future. If a new technology comes along that just does not fit into the structures that we've created in the past, it doesn't fit, it gives them a huge comparative advantage. And I'm sure they've had the lawyers by their side by building that also in technology, so that they would, basically move through the cracks of the system and build their own structure. So we have to come back the same in taxation, right? Taxation has required a physical presence. If you don't have a physical presence, how do you tax? So the OECD has been on that task for quite some time. And then you get, of course, the power play as well, with the US saying we pull out or not. But I think it's really interesting because, again, I think there are these two levels. There's this regulatory level and sort of the policy strategies, and then there's also the private law level, right? What is this thing? You know, who has property rights or privacy rights in this, and at what level do you get this? Because once the stuff is on a digital server, no, of course the companies will defend this as their property rights. And if you hack into that, you will be treated as if you were a thief, right? So this imbalance in how we allocate losses and risk and shift losses and risk and make winners and losers in the system is sort of deeply structured in the legal system as well.
Yeah, what I find really interesting is in this debate at the moment is this an idea that we are very much in finance and the digital space governed by private agreements or private law, basically. But that is, as you, Katharina, always say in your work, this is backed by the state. So it's just not like private actors get together and decided this is how we do it. No, it only works if the states are actually backing it, and as you say, or support, are enforcing those legal agreements as well. So that sort of leads to the topic that I think both of you have alluded to a lot today, but especially in your work, is this entire idea of state capacity. So we talked about sort of political issues and political capacity, but perhaps we can also hone in on this issue of state capacity. How can we increase that, change that? Because if governments, as you say, Katharina, are now supporting through US and UK private law, basically the financial systems of the world, how can we change that? I mean, it's not enough to change just sort of the politics of it, but it has also a much deeper, how do we educate people who go to these organizations and so on and so forth. So,
I think this is, go ahead.
Sorry, the cycle, which is, it depends what your theory of the state is, right? So, I mean, that's what I kind of began with before. This notion that the state has to wait for a financial crisis or a climate crisis or the COVID crisis to step in determines the kind of knowledge, capacity, and training you think that civil servants should have. If you think of all those words I mentioned before, which are good words, these aren't the words of the Tea Party to say, get the hell out of the way, state. Those who support state action use boring words, market fixing, facilitating, enabling, leveling the playing field. You won't get anything by leveling the playing field. You definitely will not get a green transformation, a Green Deal by leveling the playing field. So, this is a normative point. It's not rock. My father's a nuclear physicist. They don't have these kind of debates. Economics is a social science. It depends on what your theory of the role of the state is. And so in IAPP, what we've said is, if we want, and the answer is we do want, the state to be an active shaper, co-creator of, for example, a green transition, you actually need different instruments and tools inside state capacity. And so the MPA, the Masters in Public Administration, which we've set up, was just in its first year last year, because we're quite young as an institution, is precisely in order to debunk, in some ways to get rid of, the current training in the civil service, which is all led by public choice theory, new public management, which, to be honest, has actually convinced most bureaucrats that government failure is even worse than market failure. So even when you come in to fix a market failure, just be really careful not to take up too much space, because then the fear is you're going to crowd out business. And the irony is that you do crowd out business, meaning take up too much space and do what business should have done, but then can't do it because the state's in the way. You do crowd out business when you don't know what your role is, because you end up actually doing what business should be doing, but maybe it's too inertial or too financialized to be doing, and you take the place, as opposed to doing what we've been talking about throughout this, which is to be a real kind of active investor, an investor first resort, to do it strategically, which later can, excite and catalyze business investment, but not instead of business investment, not as a kind of a free riding option, but also creating those conditionalities. That requires a capability, as well as a level of confidence, as I mentioned before. And what we talk about in IAPP is that we need dynamic capabilities of the public sector. And if you look at the kind of courses that people take, managers take in business schools, it's all very exciting. Strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior, and they brag about the need to take risks. As soon as a civil servant takes a risk and screws up, they're on the front page of the newspaper. So in order not to take those risks, not only do they not kind of learn certain types of things like portfolio thinking from a public sector point of view, but also they outsource to the big consulting companies that I mentioned in the beginning, the PwCs, the Deloittes, the McKinseys, also because of this fear of the risk. So the project management gets done by the consulting companies, which not only gets captured in terms of the interests that might be coming in from the private sector, but the learning by doing then doesn't happen inside the civil service. So they don't build that capacity as a cumulative output of the doing.
Katharina? How do you see
Yeah, again, so I think what we're saying is so complementary in many ways, because I think I would just add again sort of how the private sector thinks about these things. So they might follow the lead of government institutions and plug along and invest in these things. That might be possible. But there's also this alternative strategy, and that's what we've seen a lot. And I don't think, not only because there wasn't government leadership, but also because there's just a lot of money to be made by simply finding ways to make sure that your actions are supported by the law, but that you don't carry the costs of regulation, right? So if you know, like one lawyer actually I teach with, she always says, you know, as a transactional lawyer, you think about the legal and regulatory structures as a scaffolding. And you're building assets or new types of intermediaries that fit through the gaps of the scaffolding. It has to be legal to work. Right? But you want to get through the gaps because your competitors might all be caught in the net. They can't get out. And you get a huge comparative advantage from being able to get through the gaps and find a new type of assets that is legal and therefore enforceable, right? And yet doesn't have to comply with the formal rules of the game. So I think, you know, there's sort of, you can have a cynical perspective on that, and my mind is a bit more cynical than the practitioners I talk to, but you can also have a positive about this, which says there's a lot of innovation, again, right? Sort of there's an innovation about how to create new types of things, and not every asset was bad, right? We have had futures and swaps and other derivatives for centuries, and they can also do good things because they can hedge, etc. But you can create these new things in ways, and that's what's happening at the same time. And so for my thinking is very often, how much of that should we allow, and where do we have to basically also create some buffers or some stops, some tripwires, as I think Greta Krippner called it, like where you just say, well, you can't do that because that's just too easy for you to make money, and you're shifting the risk of that to everybody else, and we have to bail you out in the end anyhow. So there's again sort of this, I think, this proactive leadership role that you're advocating, and I'm basically saying at the end of my book, I'm basically only thinking about how to roll back what we've given away, how to create these tripwires and roadblocks, and sort of re-challenge sort of the energy of private sector development in such a way that it's more productive and not so incredibly self-serving only for the money making of the few.
But I think they're related, you know, in Adam
I agree.
Smith,
yeah.
When they, and in my book on Value of Everything, I try to tackle both sides, and I remind the reader that Adam Smith actually, when he thought of the free market, it wasn't free from the state, it was free from rent. And rent in the time of Adam Smith was about unearned income, making money by doing nothing, literally being the troll under the bridge, charging, you know, to pass. And so there's so much intermediation and unearned income, for example, in the financial sector. And a state which not only knows how to tax that and to regulate that, but has the ability even to know what that is, you know, the distinction between profits and rents. We no longer even do that in GDP accounting. Most of what's considered profit in GDP, right? Because you can do gross domestic product accounting both from the income side and the product side. The income side, we're confusing profits with rents, and that would actually require an understanding of value and how value is created, and the distinction between, again, extraction of value and creation of value, to the point that most of the financial sector up until 1970 wasn't even included in GDP because it was basically seen as a transfer of existing income just from one part of the economy to another, in the same way that social security isn't counted because it's just a transfer. And part of that kind of deregulation of the financial sector, but also, ideology, if you want, of what value creation is, and the confusion of value with price, which we all know is a huge problem. The feminists know that. They, care, which is often free, isn't priced, and so isn't included, as well as pollution. GDP will go up if we pollute. All those different issues that have to do with the confusion of price with value and how we think about value in the economy affect also then how governments think about this issue of intermediation as good or bad, or having to be taxed or regulated away. So I do think the implications of what we're talking about are actually huge, both for the economic theory, but also how it informs practice. And now, where there are all these problems coming our way, like the ones that we've talked about, both around vaccines, around the digital economy and the digital divide, but all the different partnerships that we need in order to construct the immediate solutions, this is not a moment to take our eyes away from this problem of monopoly power, rent seeking, intermediation, value extraction. But I do think it's important to stay positive. And I don't stay positive just because I think it's a good thing in itself, but because of what both you and I have been talking about, which is agency. There is agency in the system. We have decided for the wrong reasons to structure our economy and our legal systems, our markets, our private-public partnerships in a particular way. We can unpick them. To get to the moon, by the way, it wasn't just NASA. There was Motorola, there was Honeywell, there was General Electric. But the ambition was set by government. We're going to the moon and back again. So the procurement contracts, they were short, they were snappy. And when the private sector didn't deliver, NASA threw the stuff back. Do it better. It doesn't work. Do it better. We're not paying for it until it's good, right? So that level of, again, confidence, ambition, mission, vision for what do you want to do? What is your plan? If you don't have a green plan, what plan do you have? And having that structure, these everyday relationships, I think that's key. And we do have agency. We can change the system.
Exactly. So as I said in the beginning, you both are radical in your criticism of capitalism. And I think we saw that at display here today. So I think what I find, I think it was Hyman Minsky who said that especially in finance, the governments are always regulating for the last crisis, not for the next one. And I think there is something very much in this vein that you both have been talking about today, which is basically that once we are starting to look only for the past, we are sort of misunderstanding what capitalism is and what especially the role of the state in capitalism is. But the state should also be very much a future-oriented organization. So it should look to the future. It should try to shape the future. Of course, it never will do it alone, but it should try to do it. It should have a vision for the future as well. But at the same time, of course, the government is essentially the only institution that can also set roadblocks, as Katharina was saying. So you have this double function of governments to try to envision the future that is actually better for more people than it is today, and at the same time also stop activities that are not good for the system or for the future at the same time. So this fundamentally different perspective on the state, I think, has come excellently through to our discussions today. So I want to thank you both. And I think, as Mariana was already saying, that she's staying positive. So I think seeing it in the UK, it's quite late. So maybe both of you have a very short positive impulse to give us. What keeps you the positivity to wake up tomorrow and do the work you're doing?
Let me just say one thing might be less positive than you would have imagined it, but I'm of course, we're in the United States, we're back at a moment where the cities are burning. And the cities burned last time in the late 1960s. And the response to the burning cities, which was also at that time motivated by racial issues, low-income class issues, and was interpreted by the policymakers as something that they all needed houses, right? If you got low-income families and give them credits to buy homes, then they will be fine. That set in motion securitization of mortgages and the policies that we've seen since, and I think that ended up in the end in the 2008 crisis. Today we're not more equal than we were then. We're probably less equal than we were as a society in the United States. And what we've lost in the meantime is the political institutions that are capable of creating new strategies and visions, because part of that entire strategy, we just help, we don't create social institutions, we create credit systems, has helped outsource the state. So if I want to spin this into a positive one, I think one of the lessons to learn from history is that certain strategies did not work, and they might have produced more damages than they have done good. And so learning from history in that sense of moving forward and using this crisis, which is not only a COVID crisis, it's an economic crisis, it's a social crisis in the United States, it's quickly developing in a massive political crisis. We have to think about the future and reimagine the state, but we also have to foreclose certain types of strategies, which the past tells us were not successful on multiple dimensions. Thanks.
And you, Mariana?
I could say make bread, not war, because I have my sourdough baking upstairs. Next time I'll give you guys the recipe. It's very good. No, I think the positive point for us, which is also a struggling point because it takes time, and all of our nails are very dirty because we're getting our hands quite dirty with the concrete policies and debates in different countries, is to remember this issue of heterogeneity. We've talked so much about government and business, but actually there's such differences in how governments are acting with COVID, the capacity they have, which we talked about, the degree to which there's willingness and boldness and courage to actually have these conditionalities. Elizabeth Warren is fighting for this in the US to have stronger conditionalities. As I mentioned, Denmark has made it illegal to get a bailout if you use tax havens. There's so much to learn, kind of what works, what doesn't, and to kind of elevate up the good examples and to talk about them, put them in the newspapers, have debates about the good way of structuring our system. There's not enough talk about those good examples. Unfortunately, so much of the negative has been driven by very powerful countries, including in the US, even though within the US, there's some interesting examples as we talked about. But I think we all need to be really shining our magnifying glass and our torches on some really interesting things that are happening, and then asking, what would it take? What would it take to scale that up and to make the system work in such a way that those examples, which are actually currently just exceptions, become the rule? And unpicking the legal, the economic, the social, the behavioral from those, and learning. I think we need to learn, and hence the need for collective intelligence that I talked about before with vaccine production. Hopefully part of this debate will have added a bit to that collective intelligence, but it is an uphill battle.
So I would like to thank both Mariana and Katharina for providing such stimulating
Thank you.
and ideas.
Thank you very much.